So as we all know, Dead Island 2 released earlier this year with it being much better than most people expected, with it actually running and doing exactly what it was meant to do. But yes, arguably it's lacking in some content once you complete the main story and do all the side quests. The replayability is there with the characters and its different attributes, and because it doesn't have that much variety, it lacks in the replayability because it wants to rely on essentially something that doesn't supply what it tries to achieve. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Dead Island 2 is a great game. The game that we got is much more playable and much more stable than I believe we all expected. However, don't you ever wonder what happened to Yager's version? The version that we seen all the way back in 2014, the version that was supposed to compete with the original Dying Light. Well, the final version that we got from Dambuster Studios earlier this year is still within Yager's creative vision. It's also obviously a completely different game. It's in a completely different game engine. Technology has advanced in the last couple years since 2014. Obviously, we have the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and PCs are much more stronger. However, recently there was an article that dropped that gave a little bit more information on Yager's version of that game. A little bit of discrepancies between Deep Silver and Yager's creative vision, as well as some struggles that Yager was ultimately having. Like, did you know Yager was expected to release the game within a year from its announcement? I mean, obviously that makes sense. If you remember correctly, the announcement trailer was in 2014. We got a Gamescom gameplay pre-alpha footage in 2014, and then the release date was somewhere around April 2015. Obviously, within a span of a couple months, the game was expected to be up and running. Pre-orders were already live as soon as it was announced, and yet, in spite of only one announcement trailer and this rough pre-alpha footage, it's crazy to think that not only were pre-orders live, but people were actually buying them. They're actually pre-ordering this version of the game without any concrete knowledge on what the actual game's state was in, how far the game's development was, and really what Yager's focus was at. Now, I'm going to leave the article linked down in the description. It's a pretty fascinating read if you care anything about the history of Dying Light or even Dead Island and what happened between Techland, the developers of the original Dead Island that moved on to Dying Light, and of course Deep Silver, and then ultimately it goes into details on how Yager landed the job with Dead Island 2. Basically, after Techland and Deep Silver parted ways, Deep Silver put out a request for proposal. Basically, they invited developers to give them their pitch on what their version of Dead Island 2 would look like, and Yager landed the job because they put in the lowest bid, basically. So Deep Silver was trying to cut costs, and ultimately, in the end, it came out to bite them in the ass because they were only willing to put up a third of what Dead Island 2's budget was requiring. But that's just the least of the concerns. According to this article, Unreal Engine 4, the engine that Yager's version of Dead Island 2 ran off of, was so taxing that they couldn't even get it to run on consoles. They said PC ran phenomenally well. There was some instances where it would struggle for textures and pop-ins to load in, but it would, for the most part, be able to run on PC. As far as consoles went, some of the Yager developers went on record, they're all anonymous by the way, but they went on record by stating that on a console you would load in and you would have to wait a couple minutes for the smallest of things like a trash can to load in. You would try to move forward and you wouldn't realize that something's blocking your path because the consoles, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One weren't strong enough to generate these objects, and the maps that Yager's version of Dead Island 2 was trying to incorporate were so massive that it didn't help. Obviously, Yager's version of Dead Island also took place in Los Angeles and California. However, their version also incorporated larger scale areas. Like, they had a massive medium-sized battlefield map that took place in San Francisco, and that was going to be that game's version of a tutorial. They were also going to have a map centered around the Redwood National Forest. It sounds like actually at one point it was going to be one massive open world, but because, as I said, Unreal Engine 4 was so taxing that one of the decisions was to break all the maps up. One of the solutions, as a matter of fact, was to make a map like Los Angeles, for instance, 4 separate maps instead of 1. And because Deep Silver, in the very early stages of Dead Island 2's development, decided to shift focus, they basically wanted this game to be 8-player co-op with the game always being online. They actually came to Yager and said, we want this game to be quote-unquote seamless multiplayer. And here's a kicker. Deep Silver and Yager, which, by the way, Yager's most known for Spec Ops: The Line, which is a single-player, third-person military shooter. Narratively speaking, it's probably one of the greatest games of all time. I did a video on it here, you can check it out. But nonetheless, Deep Silver came to Yager and said, we want to make this game 8-player co-op, always online, with it being seamless multiplayer. Yager's response is, what is seamless multiplayer? Deep Silver's response is, you'll figure it out. So not only do we have a game that's incredibly taxing, you can't run it on consoles, but now you want to make it seamless multiplayer with it always be online, something that the development team has no experience with. It sounds like a giant shit show behind the scenes, doesn't it? And Yager said that the tutorial system for San Francisco was practically done. It was almost playable, still struggled to load in a lot of the areas, but they said every building, for instance, they had a pier in San Francisco, and they said every building on the pier were all buildings you can enter, with them all being fully furnished, which again was obviously something that was a little too taxing for consoles to run. But they tried to come up with multiple solutions. At one point, because now they got to make this a multiplayer experience, they thought of making the larger areas like San Francisco, Los Angeles be a little bit more linear, you know, divided up into sections, and then the smaller areas being more like miniature hubs in between where players can join in and join out. Ultimately, it's kind of a crazy business if you think about it. If you look at the trailer, if you look at the gameplay footage from 2014, you can tell the game was nowhere near ready. They were expected to be done in months. Yager says that their team was divided in two. Part of them was saying, fuck it, we're gonna make it work. We have no choice, ultimately. The other team was saying, hey, we got this, it's a couple months, it's no big deal. All the while, behind the scenes, Deep Silver was already divided themselves among switching developers, pulling the plug on what Yager was working on. It's funny because in the same article, it talks about how staff of Deep Silver were completely shocked to hear that Dead Island 2 had been handed off to Sumer Digital, the developer behind Sonic and All Stars Racing, as well as Little Big Planet 3. They said some of their staff had no idea who the hell they were. They had to Google them, and they were surprised to hear that all they've ever done were kart racing games. Now they're being handed the IP of an M-rated open world game. I mean, when you think about it out loud, the only point of that makes kind of a little bit of sense is the fact that you want to have 8 players online. The kart racing, Sumo Digital might have had a little bit more experience with that, so the higher ups in Deep Silver might have been thinking from that perspective, but ultimately, it still makes no sense. At the end of the day, what do you think? You think Yager would have pulled it off? Would you have still purchased whatever Yager had put together? Or do you think Deep Silver would probably repurpose that San Francisco and that Redwood idea and put it into the DLC for the Dead Island 2 we have now? Because remember, Dead Island 2 does have DLC coming out. It's definitely an interesting conversation to have down in the comment section.